Welcome back, everyone. We are on to a new chapter, chapter 6, where we are going to look at aggregate incomes. So, one of the main themes of this chapter, this section of the course, is to try to compare our standards of living across countries. So, we would like to know, for example, is the standard of living in the United States higher, lower, or the same than the standard of living in, say, China, as one example. And so the way that we can measure this in macroeconomics is to look at our aggregate incomes and do some manipulations, and we'll be able to compare these things across countries as well as within a country at different points in time. So we've got our various learning objectives here that we'll try to tackle in this chapter. And our very first one is to understand our incomes or GDP per capita or per person. That's our goal here, which is a pretty easy concept at the end of the day to understand. So, kind of the motivating example for this chapter in general is to compare these two job offers you have in two different locations. So you have a job offer for $60,000 with a company in Neenah, and you have another job offer that pays more, $70,000, with a company in New York. And if I took as exactly the same your preferences for location, so assuming that you don't prefer any location over the other, what offer would you take? Right? So I mean when you only consider your income, and why. So my guess is almost all of you said, if I'm just basing it on income, I'm going to work for the company in Neenah. Why is that? Well, the cost of living is much higher in New York. So that my purchasing power with my $60,000, my real income, is going to be much higher if I work in Neenah. All right. So let's see where we go with that analogy. And here's one example, right? So it gets a little trickier across countries, but it's the same idea. So our total real GDP in the US is $19.1 trillion, right? So that's, around $20 trillion. Real GDP in Japan is 531.2 trillion in Japanese yen. And so I want to know, how do I compare those two quantities, right? In order to do that, I have to know how the US dollar and the Japanese yen relate to each other. That's very similar to trying to convert my $60,000 in Neenah to $70,000 in New York. If I know the price differences, I can calculate a comparison. And that's what we're going to try to do when we think about comparing different countries. They have different currencies, and we need to know how those currencies relate to each other to make the comparison valid. Before we get to that, which is a slightly more complicated change to make, we also need to take into account the size of the population, right? So if I compare total real GDP in China, so if I make the conversion, so they're both in the same units. So here I'm going to put GDP of China and GDP of Japan in US dollars, which we'll learn how to do in an upcoming video. GDP in China is 12.24 trillion US dollars compared to Japan, which is 4.87 trillion. So based on that information, would you conclude that the standard of living is higher in China than Japan, right? They have more total production. The more we think about it, it's okay, yes, China has more total production, but they also have a lot more people, right? The population of China is many times that of Japan. So simply having higher total GDP, higher total income, doesn't really answer the question of standard of living, which is ultimately what we're after here. And so you get a pretty quick sense that what I need to do is convert these to per person numbers, right? How much GDP is produced in China per person compared to Japan per person? And that's exactly what we do. We're going to take GDP per capita, which is simply GDP divided by number of people. So in the end, it's a pretty simple calculation. And so here we go. So if I add in the populations, we can calculate GDP per capita in each country. So there's examples like this on the homework. And, there's potentially easier ways to do this, right? If you're comfortable with, multiplying by tens, etc., you can kind of simplify this. The surefire way, which I'm going to give you here, and you can simplify it if that's easier, is just to write out, unfortunately, what is 12.24 trillion, right? So what is in China GDP per capita? Well, 12.24 trillion, we're just going to add zeros, right? So I add 3, and I've got millions. I add 3 more, and I've got billions. If I add 3 more, I now have trillions. So that is $12.24 trillion. And to convert to per capita, I have to divide by their population, which is 1.386 billion. So that is 1,386. 3 zeros is million. 3 more is billion. So if you type that into your calculator, you should get, if I remember right, it's $8,831 of GDP per capita that is available in China. All right. So, while their total GDP is relatively high, so is their population. So GDP per capita, which is one way that we look at standard of living, is relatively low, as we'll see when we compare that to Japan. So if I come up here and I look at Japan, their GDP is 4.87 trillion. So that's 487. 3 is million, 3 more zeros is billion, 3 more is trillion. Their population size is only 126.8 million. So, it's about a tenth of the size of the population in China. So 126.8 million, 3 zeros. So if you divide that out, it's somewhere in the 38,000, so about $38,407. So GDP per capita, the very intuitive way to compare output per person, which is one measure of standard of living across countries. So once I take account for population, we see that Japan is much better off than China, right? So despite having lower total GDP, each person has more. Okay, so that is GDP per capita. That's our first sense of standard of living. So in the next video, we will look at how do we mess around with the different currencies.